So I have 7:01 p.m. I'm going to go ahead and please invite our executive director, Mike Carr, to join us.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks to all of you out there in the ether on a winter night for joining us. We're excited about this presentation, and we had something like 122 registered this evening. So thank you very much for making time. Before we start with Scott and Nancy, I'd just like to introduce the Adirondack Land Trust to any of you that might not know us, just to give you a sense of who we are and what we do. We're a nonprofit land saving group founded in 1984 that focuses on places that make the Adirondack Park function, not just as an intact ecosystem, but also as a landscape that supports communities like Keene, where our offices are currently. Supporters and partners have helped us conserve 27,606 acres at 100 sites in 10 counties, and we have more than 10,000 acres in the pipeline right now. These are farms, forests, waters, and wild places that have the power to make the Adirondacks healthier and people healthier. We recognize that as one of the greatest conservation undertakings on Earth, the Adirondacks needs a land trust scaled to this region's promise, challenges, and opportunities. We're well positioned to rise to this challenge. Not only does our staff of 14 full-time and 1 part-time collectively have more than 170 years of conservation experience and expertise, but we have an engaged board, a growing donor base, and the trust of landowners and partners to accelerate the pace of land protection. Finally, we all know that the Adirondack Park is famous for its forest preserve, and we've added about 3,500 acres to forever wild public lands. But we also know that private ownerships are critical to holding this landscape together. Wildlife species like the yellow warbler do not make a distinction between public or private land. They need viable habitat to thrive, and that's such an important part of our work. So thank you again for joining us this evening. Kathy Woofter, our Philanthropy and Outreach Coordinator, will introduce our distinguished speakers.
Thank you, Mike. It's really my pleasure to do this for this really, I think, unique event, although with what feels like just criminally abbreviated bios, I could talk for an hour about their accolades alone tonight. So let me start with Scott. Scott Weidensaul has written more than 30 books, including his widely acclaimed Living on the Wind, Across the Hemisphere with Migratory Birds, which was a finalist for the 2000 Pulitzer-Prize, and A World on the Wing, The Global Odyssey of Migratory Birds, a New York Times bestseller, and of course, the book we're talking about today, A Warbler's Journey. In addition to writing about wildlife, Scott is an active field researcher whose work focuses on bird migration. He's a co-director of Project Owlnet, and for more than 25 years, he's directed a major effort to study the movements of northern saw-whet owls, one of the smallest and least understood raptors in North America. More recently, Scott co-founded Project Snowstorm, which uses cutting-edge tracking technology to study snowy owls. Scott lectures widely on conservation and nature, and we at the Adirondack Land Trust were fortunate enough to hear Scott speak this past summer and in Lake Placid at a private event. Scott and his wife Amy live in the northern Appalachians of New Hampshire. Now I'd love to welcome Nancy. Nancy Lane spent 30 years as an illustrator of award-winning picture books that celebrate the human-animal bond. Several years ago, she returned to oil painting with an outdoor focus, always choosing subjects that portray empathy for nature and animals. Nancy earned the 2022 award for Outstanding Watercolor at the International Bold Brush Painting Competition and Best in Show at the 2020 Yates County National Juried Exhibition, among many other awards. Her work has been featured in American Art Collector and Life in the Finger Lakes magazines. Nancy's a popular watercolor instructor, and she's often asked to give painting demonstrations for various art organizations. Nancy and her husband, Mark, live in the Finger Lakes of Western New York. And just really quickly, before we get started, I just have to tell a short story about how this program came about, because this is something that I think is a little unique. Nancy and her husband, Mark, and I were hiking on some land we protect. And I'd never met them before. And Nancy and I were just chatting, and I asked her what she did for a living. And Nancy said she was an oil painter, but we talked about painting for a while, but she said she had recently collaborated on a children's book about bird migration with a renowned scientist who was a Pulitzer-Prize finalist. So I just met Scott about a month before, and I knew this was just way too much of a coincidence. So I said, I couldn't possibly be Scott Weidensaul, could it? And indeed it was. And one thing led to another, and here we are tonight. So it is time now to turn it over to our speakers. We will have a few minutes for questions at the end. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. So Scott, it is my pleasure to ask you to kick things off. So the floor or the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. And it just goes to show that the world of birds is a very small world. All right, bear with me for a second here while we do the screen share thing. And let me just, whoops. And Nancy, give me a thumbs up if we got the cover, your lovely cover there. Okay, super. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this book came to be, and then pass things over to Nancy to talk about how she made it look so dazzlingly beautiful. But the one thing you need to understand about me is that I have been obsessed with migration pretty much my entire life. I got hooked on migration more than 50 years ago as a kid growing up in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania. There's a place called Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which perches up on Kittatinny Ridge, this high ridge top in central Appalachians, along which every fall this enormous migration of hawks and eagles and falcons and vultures passes. And on my very first trip there as a 12-year-old in the early 1970s, I got hooked on the Appalachian Mountains, which have obsessed me ever since. I got hooked on raptors because raptors are the coolest of all birds, but mostly I got hooked on migration. And in the years since then, I've gotten more and more deeply involved in studying migration. You have to understand, I do not have an academic degree in science. In fact, I do not have an academic degree in anything. I stand before you as a college dropout. But ornithology has always been the branch of science most welcoming of committed, slightly crazy outsiders. And starting in the 1980s, I began to get involved with bird banding, especially trapping and banding hawks and eagles and falcons like this young peregrine falcon, doing some radio telemetry at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, working with their research crew, eventually getting a federal banding license of my own. And over the last 25 years, 30 years or so, gotten, as I say, more and more deeply involved in migration research. And Kathy touched on a couple of these points. For the last 26 or 27 years, I've been overseeing a big project in the mountains of Pennsylvania, studying these ridiculously cute little northern saw-whet owls. We've banded about 13,000 of them over the years. We've used radio telemetry and geolocation and radar to study their migration. I'm part of a continental effort to understand why many species of western hummingbirds, like this rufous hummingbird, are evolving a new migratory route and wintering area in the east and southeast. Kathy mentioned Project Snowstorm, which started 10 years ago, where we're using these GPS, GSM transmitters to follow wintering snowy owls to learn more about how they live their lives when they're down here out of the Arctic with us. And for about the last 10 years, I've also been involved with a project in Denali National Park in Alaska, studying bird migration up there and trying really hard not to run into too many of these guys. Working with grizzly bears in the landscape can keep you on your toes. But it's amazing. I mean, because even the smallest migratory birds do astonishing things. I mean, one of the species that we study in Alaska are black-poll warblers. That's an adult male on the right in spring plumage. That's what they look like in the fall. And the black-poll warblers that we study in central Alaska migrate all the way to northern South America. And many of them will fly for 80 or 90 hours over the western Atlantic Ocean on their way to their wintering grounds in South America. So they make these enormous migrations. So, I mean, this is the sort of thing that I love to share with people, the fact that migratory birds do things that seem incomprehensible. If you think it's crazy that a tiny little warbler that weighs less than half an ounce, you could mail 2 of these things anywhere in the country for a first-class stamp, that they fly to South America. Consider that the bar-tailed godwit, which is about the size of a pigeon, this long-billed, long-legged shorebird, takes off from the coast of western Alaska every year in August and September and makes the longest nonstop migration of any bird that we know of on the planet. That's their route in red going south across the widest part of the Pacific Ocean, from Alaska to New Zealand and the coast of Australia. That's a journey that takes anywhere from 7 to 11 days of continuous powered nonstop flight, 8,100 miles across the emptiest quarter of the world. And then in the spring, and then rather than flying back into the headwinds that brought them down there, they fly 6,000 miles from New Zealand to the Yellow Sea between China and the Korean Peninsula, rest and refuel, and then fly another 4,000 or 5,000 miles back to Alaska. 18,000 miles a year, a bird the size of a pigeon that will live 25 or 30 years and fly in the course of its lifetime the distance from here to the moon and most of the way back. You get the sense that I love talking about migration. And so in the early months, I should say, of the pandemic in 2020, I was very interested to get a request through my agent from the Griffin Press, which is a mother and daughter operation out of Minneapolis. The Griffin Press, as you see there, publishes children's books celebrating the human-animal bond. And they were interested in, they wanted to know whether I'd be interested in doing a children's picture book about bird migration. Well, heck yeah. Like I said, I'm crazy about migration and I love talking about it with every audience I possibly can. But I said, look, here's the thing. A lot of children's picture books are really cutesy, and a lot of them anthropomorphize the animal. And it's not that I don't think birds are highly intelligent and highly complex, but they're not little people. And I was interested in doing a book as long as it would be faithful to the science and respectful of the bird as a bird. And so Emily Buchwald and her daughter Dana agreed to this. We had some discussions along the way. There were a couple of times where I had to, kind of decide this was, something was a hill that I was willing to die for, but it was for the most part a really great collaborative process. And so over the course of the next 6 months or so, I developed the storyline, and I wanted to tell a story of a small migratory bird, one whose journey would seem improbable just because of the size, that would touch on the importance of protected landscapes and healthy landscapes all along the course of this bird's migration. Well, one of the groups that I've been working with for 20 years are hummingbirds. So my first thought was, what about a ruby-throated hummingbird like this one? I've been banding hummingbirds for 25 years. In fact, you can actually see the band on the leg of this male. They weigh a couple of grams. They fly 600 miles nonstop twice a year across the Gulf of Mexico. At least some of them do. But Emily and Dana, who knew the children's publishing world much better than I did, noted that there's a bunch of children's books about hummingbirds. And they said, this is liable to just kind of get lost in the noise. What are there other species of birds that you'd be able to tell this story that might stand out a little bit from the crowd? Well, there are hundreds of species of migratory birds. And so finding a good hero bird, as Emily and Dana would put it, was not all that difficult. In fact, the one that immediately recommended itself to me was a yellow warbler. And part of the reason for that is, well, yes, yellow warblers are gorgeous, but they're also found absolutely everywhere in North America. From their wintering grounds in northern South America and Central America, on their migration and across the breeding grounds shown here in red, there isn't a square mile of North America that doesn't have yellow warblers at some point during the year. But, the more I thought about this, the one thing I decided was I didn't want to make the focus of this book a male yellow warbler. Now, nothing against male yellow warblers. As you can see, this is what they look like, these natty, beautiful little golden birds with chestnut streaks on their breast. But the female yellow warblers have, as my good friend and fellow scientist Sarah Morris likes to say, their own subtle beauty. And let's face it, the females have a tendency to get overlooked. And they're doing, like Ginger Rogers, everything Fred Astaire does except backwards and in high heels. They're making this enormous long migration and then immediately settling down and starting to breed, which is a huge energetic investment. So we had our hero bird, we had our focus. And I wanted to set the story particularly in 3 places: in the highlands of Central America, on a traditional shade coffee farm, because these traditional, what are known as rustic shade coffee farms, are incredibly important habitat for hundreds of species of migratory birds, as well as hundreds of species of resident tropical birds like this gorgeous crimson-collared tanager. And I admit that when you look at that landscape, you're not thinking there's anything agriculture there, but I guarantee you everything you see in that picture to the horizon is a traditional shade coffee farm where small farmers, small family operations grow coffee in the shade of a functioning, intact, biodiverse forest. It produces really good coffee and protects really good habitat for birds. I wanted to set part of the story along the Gulf Coast, in the backyard of somebody who recognized the importance of gardening with native plants for birds, and also in an indigenous community in the subarctic of Canada at the end of this warbler's migration. Whether we're talking about a family in the highlands of Nicaragua, a Black grandmother and her grandson on the coast of, on the Gulf Coast, or an indigenous community in the north, the issue is I'm an old white guy. So I wanted to make sure to the extent that I could that I was being culturally sensitive and culturally appropriate. So for example, with the Nicaraguan material, I turned to my good friend Jefferson Shriver, who's been living in Nicaragua for decades, is married to a Nicaraguan woman, and along with her founded Gaia Farms, which is a large and really biodiverse shade coffee farm on the Pacific coast of Nicaragua. I've had an opportunity to travel with Jefferson a couple of times in Nicaragua. He knows the shade coffee business and the shade coffee farmers extremely well. As far as the folks in the Gulf Coast, I turned to Juita Martinez, who is a doctoral student at LSU studying pelican ecology. I'd gotten to know her when I interviewed her for a story about the anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Juita is one of the founders of Black Birders Week, and was generous with her time in helping with making sure that I wasn't putting my foot wrong with anything on that side. And up at the far end of the migration, the community that we were basing the community in the story on is the community of Lutzel Cay, which is a Dene First Nation community on Great Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories of Canada. Just one of the most extraordinarily beautiful landscapes on the planet, as I found out last summer when I had a chance to go up there and spend time out in the field with members of that community like Pete Enzo, whose family has been on the Great Slave Lake for probably about 10,000 years or so. So we had our story. What we needed was an artist. And Emily and Dana and I had long conversations about, we kicked around the names of many prominent artists, including a lot of prominent bird artists. And they said, but actually their recommendation was that they wanted to work with an artist named Nancy Lane, who had done quite a few picture books for them in the past. And I thought, well, I don't really want children's picture book illustration for this. And they said, no, take a look at Nancy's website. And as soon as I saw Nancy's oil paintings, I absolutely fell in love. Now, as Nancy can tell you, we had a little bit of a hard time convincing her to do this project because she had no interest in going back and doing the kind of children's picture books that she had done in the past. And we said, no. What we want you to do is the kind of really evocative, emotional landscape and portraiture work that you see here. And fortunately for us, Nancy said yes. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Nancy, who is going to take you through the process of turning my very humble words into absolutely gorgeous art. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Nancy, you can take it away.
Oh, thank you, Scott. That was fascinating. Thanks so much. All right, I will share my screen now. Bear with me. And okay. So I'll talk about creating the art for this book. And I first just want to go back in time a little bit to give you a sense of my former life or younger life, things that really contributed to becoming an illustrator and actually contributed to being able to make this book. I was so lucky as a kid because my parents took us on all kinds of camping trips, and I spent a lot of time out in nature. And here you actually see me on the top of an Adirondack mountain in the center there. Lots of hiking, lots of summers in the Adirondacks, canoeing, and just messing around in nature. Those experiences created such a love in me for animals and nature that they really are what led me to start drawing and become a picture book illustrator. I grew up in Rochester, live in the Finger Lakes now, but continue to come to the Adirondacks quite often. And as a little girl, I'd stand on top of these mountains and look out at all those beautiful blue Adirondack lakes and think, I wonder what it would be like to be a bird and fly out over all those lakes. Well, that came in handy in this book. As I got older and got married, I had children and continued my work as a freelance illustrator. But we wanted our kids to also experience the Adirondack Mountains. And we started taking them to this place near Upper J. We ended up going there over the course of 11 years. We made 14 visits to this place, which I am thrilled and grateful to say is now under the care of the Adirondack Land Trust. Well, here I am painting on one of these mountains. One of my early paintings, don't look too close, but I was practicing a particular way of painting called plein air painting, which is basically painting outdoors, because as an illustrator, I was kind of stuck in the studio working from photos all the time. And I just wanted to get out there and do my own thing. So I began this practice of plein air painting. So here are some more scenes of me in the Adirondacks painting. And you might ask, well, why is this such an important thing? What does this have to do with the book? Well, I quickly found when you're painting from life, you can see the colors better. You can see into the dark shadows that often in a photograph just turn dark. You know, I'm not a professional photographer, but typically photographs are a lens. They're creating their basic filter that is not the same as how a human eye sees. So it became a wonderful way to learn how to paint better, to experience all the senses, the smells, the breeze, the bird calls. It all helped feed into the painting and taught me to be a better painter. Here's some more scenes from the Adirondacks. I started going with groups of painters and staying an entire week, and we'd paint 1 or 2 paintings every day. I got really interested in how the light moves across the landscape and how that light creates a mood. So for instance, in the scene on the left, it's a foggy, well, actually it started to rain, misty day, but it was very calm and quiet. But another day it might have been a morning sun and it would be very happy. So you'll see some of those scenes in the book. Moonlight, kind of like the painting behind me, which is a painting for the book. I was actually camping during a full moon and was able to work on one of the paintings for the book while looking at the moon. One of the scenes in the book has lightning. Now, I don't paint during lightning storms, but that kind of light is very cold and scary. And then there's starlight, which can feel very faint, but also very magical and wondrous. So I was trying to pull all these different forms of light into the book to create a mood and evoke emotion. So the Griffin Press called and proposed this book about bird migration, written by this guy named Scott Weidensaul. And I'm sorry, Scott, I didn't know who you were, but they assured me that you were a good guy. And I said, okay, great. Well, send me the manuscript. I'm interested because I like birds, and they sent me the manuscript, and boy, was I impressed. You know, for a science writer, I thought your children's manuscript was wonderful. I thought that it was very poetic and very moving, honestly. And so I was extremely interested. This is what the actual manuscript looked like. I immediately start scribbling and having ideas as I read it. So I thought about it, I think for a long time, maybe even a month. And I had one final issue that I wanted to resolve before I agreed. And that is that in all my past books, you can see on the left, this is from a watercolor book that I did for the Griffin Press. I often had to leave a space in the illustrations for the words. And this makes it very difficult to design the page. And it also means that once you're done, you kind of often have a hole in the middle of the art. And I wanted to be able to create these paintings independent of the words and not have to worry about that, so that the images would be more cohesive. And I proposed the design on the right. And now this actually is a spread from our book with the story separate from the art. And I think it actually highlights the story better, gives Scott's words a much more attention. And they alternate page by page. And happily, the publisher agreed. So we had a deal. So I had yet to meet Scott, but I did. This is the first step of what I do for a book. I do these little sketches that I call thumbnails. They're about 1 inch by 2 inches. And each one represents a scene in the book. I do them fairly quickly. It's sort of like a rough draft. Just the first idea that pops in my head. And my goal here is to see, as I go from page to page, is there variety? Is there a change of direction, or perhaps a change of mood? Is there some dark scenes and then some light scenes? Are there some close-up scenes and then a far away, or maybe a bird's eye view? I want the reader to stay engaged from scene to scene and to not have things get stuck. So once I finished these, we had our first Zoom with Scott. I was a little nervous because normally this stuff is not shared with authors. They never get to see these rough drafts or even anything leading up to the final art. But he seemed to understand what was going on here. He seemed okay with it. And so we went ahead. He had a few little minor suggestions, mostly just corrections and improvements. I was initially nervous when the publisher suggested we work together, because I wasn't used to that. In the traditional publishing world, the publisher's the go-between, and she keeps the illustrator and art and author separate and sort of is the middleman. But I think Emily had gotten to know Scott enough and trusted that he would not be stepping on my artistic toes, but just advising us on getting the science right, which is important to all of us, and getting the facts right. Here's a quick little preview of the 3 major steps I go through. You've seen the thumbnails. That's the first step. From there, once the thumbnails are approved by the editor or publisher, I move on to the sketch phase. Those are about 5 by 7, and they're always black and white. And that's the stage that you want to fix everything and correct anything in error. And once those are all approved and revised, then I would move on to the final art, which in this case were these large oil paintings that were 18 by 24. And here you can see I got to indulge my imagination by flying over a big lake. Scott provided me with plenty of reference images from all his many travel photos. These were just invaluable to me. I would take bits and pieces of all these and incorporate them into the scene that I imagined for each page in the book. And he also gave me all kinds of web links. It was just so helpful. Normally I would have to find all this stuff on my own. So that was wonderful. Here are a few that I did find on my own, just from all over the place, different poses that the bird was in, people I needed to feature, settings, appropriate clothing for the Dene First Nation people. And again, these I filed away. I had a folder for each painting, 18 folders in all. not only at paper, but also folders on my desktop. So it's kind of a big organizational feat. So with all that information, took it all in and created the sketches, the middle phase. Now, what's different about these from my past sketches for watercolors is that I did these in charcoal. This was a very intentional choice because I was doing these quote unquote fine art paintings, and I just wanted to hang on to that feeling, that mood. And I was afraid if I did them in a line drawing that I might get lost in the details. So by doing charcoal, I could really push that black and white, those values to hold on to that emotion. I do this step, it's called a book dummy, where I photograph my little sketches and I enlarge them on a photocopier, glue them together, fit the type onto each page just to make sure the type fits and flows nicely from page to page. And it's just kind of nice to have it at actual size to make sure the art is leading the eye to the right, which you want it to do, and that all the copy fits. All right, I'm going to walk you through 3 scenes from the book to close out here. This first scene is the bird garden on the Gulf Coast. This is the thumbnail. Remember, this was only 1 inch by 2 inches. Scott was very helpful in telling me that the birders would not like my bird bath because birds are attracted to the sound of water, and a fountain would really be much better. So I really appreciate that. So that was one of his first things that he tipped me off to. So, and also on the side, you can see some notes I gave to myself. I was just goals that I wanted this particular scene to feature. So top left is the sketch I came up with. And I have a beautiful little fountain there. And I also have a lot of flowering plants that he helped me with by telling me what was in bloom and links to where I could see what the plant looked like. So I created this whole garden based on his web links. In the center, you'll see the beginning of the painting. I am blocking in just the sunlight and the shadows, again, to create that beautiful, warm, sunny Gulf Coast morning where the warbler has just arrived from making it across that long trip across the Gulf. And these are some processes of the painting. Starting with number 1, you can see where I've just kind of blocked in quickly. The colors, proceeding to number 2, I've started putting a little more of the clothing in and flowers. And number 3 was the final until we realized that I had put some cardinal flowers on the plants they were planting, but those aren't blooming till the summer when the hummingbirds will enjoy them. So I quickly had to paint those cardinal flowers out. And you'll see in number 4, there are no longer any flowers blooming on those little plants that they're about to plant. And here is the final for the Gulf Coast Garden. This particular scene, again, we're looking at the thumbnail sketch, is the Dene First Nation people living up in the Northwest Territories. And we have a young girl at the side of a big lake. She's very excited that this is the day they are celebrating that their people will be given the managing position of their ancestral lands. I hired the daughter of a friend to pose for me for this. And I told her the story and she struck several poses. And we ended up deciding on the more quiet pose. She was a great model. And so I came up with this sketch. Now, again, you can see the process here. The sketches at the top left, not near number 1, were my guide as I painted in the painting, first with just an underpainting of the darks and lights, and gradually building up the colors, as you can see through 2, 3, and 4. I tried to reach out to the woman who is tasked with managing the national park. And I found her on Facebook, and I actually texted her the drawings because I wanted to make sure the clothing was right, the village was right. And she just wouldn't answer me. Finally, a few weeks later, I got an answer. And she said, "Oh, we've been out on the land." And I just love that expression. She had been out with a bunch of young people, teaching them traditional indigenous ways to work out on the land. And she looked at my sketches and she liked them. So we were able to go ahead with this. This is just a quick shot of my workspace. You can see the sketch up at the left and some of Scott's references that were inspiring me, and sort of get a feel for how I took all the little pieces and designed them all together into a new painting. This one featuring our little warbler. And finally, to close here, this particular spread is my favorite. It was my favorite part of Scott's story about when songbirds are migrating at night. I thought his words were just so poetic, so evocative, and just filled me with such awe. I was a little unsure how to show this, though. I mean, think about it. You can't photograph migrating songbirds at night. They're way up there in the dark sky, right? So I thought about, how can I show this? And I remembered I had been on a kayak in the middle of the night out on a quiet Adirondack lake, and the sky was just bursting with stars, and the stars were reflecting on the surface of the lake, right? And it was so dark up there. You couldn't see the shoreline at all. And you felt almost disoriented, like you were actually in space. And it was one of the most beautiful things I've done. And I thought, that's what it must feel like to be a little bird migrating at night. I came up with this painting based on that experience. And I just want you to imagine you're asleep at night in your bed, right? Twice a year. And far above you, way up in the sky, are all these little birds, these little bits of fluff. And they are flying so low, but they can hear other little birds around them. And they are just trusting this dim starlight that they can barely see, but they're able to take that, and it helps guide them to their journey over these incredibly vast distances. I feel such awe at knowing this, and I feel like all of us, no matter what our age, just can feel awe for this incredible feat that we call bird migration. Thank you.
Nancy and Scott, thank you so much. That was incredible. And it's just amazing to see your passions collide like this to create this incredible book. Hi, everyone. My name is Derek Rogers. And I just want to thank you all for joining tonight. And we have a lot of time left. We have about 20 minutes left for some Q&A. Before we get into that, again, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Derek Rogers. I'm the stewardship manager at the Adirondack Land Trust. And in addition to my work at the Land Trust, I'm an avid birder. And I've worked on many statewide ornithological initiatives. And on top of this, I'm a father of 2 young girls, and I'm always looking for opportunities to inspire their fascination with the outdoors and birds, of course. So this book really resonated with me and my family personally. And I'll never forget when I first read A Warbler's Journey to my 4-year-old Phoebe. We finished the book and she asked me, "Daddy, can I bring this book to bed with me tonight?" She's never asked that before. And it quickly became one of her favorites. So I just want to thank you guys both personally for deepening her connection to nature. Really, really special stuff. So again, we have a couple questions coming in from the chat. Now's your time to ask them, but I'd like to kick it off based on that story I had just told you about my daughter Phoebe, and want to ask you, Nancy and Scott, about any unexpected challenges translating your work to a younger audience than you might usually write and create for.
Well, from the word perspective, yeah, I've written for children a couple of times in the past, but it's not what I normally do. I normally write adult nonfiction, but I also don't like talking down to children, and so I tried to make the book understandable, but poetic, lyric, trying to capture that sense of the sense of awe Nancy was just talking about. I mean, look, anybody who doesn't have their pulse quicken a little bit by the thought of, you know, millions of birds flying overhead through the dark night sky, crossing these immensities of space, really needs to check their pulse. As far as challenges go, actually, the one challenge that I had in dealing with this, the challenge with Emily and Dana at the Griffin Press, was that they really wanted me to give this bird a name. And I understand why, because there's a whole raft of peer-reviewed science in the humane literature that shows that children connect more and engage more directly with real animals or fictional animals that have a name. But I don't know what a little bird's name would be. I'm sure I wouldn't be at all surprised to discover that yellow warblers have individual names, you know, something that they recognize as themselves, and, you know, in vocalizations that others use to pick them out, just as we use our own names. But I don't know what that is. And where we finally left it was when I said, okay, so then what name should the bird have? Should it have a Spanish name when it's in Nicaragua? Should it have an Anglo name when it's in the Gulf Coast, or should it have a Dene First Nation name when it's up in Northwest Territories? And at that point, they somewhat reluctantly backed down. But I will say, Nancy had my back on that one. She understood exactly where I was coming from on that. And let me just say, she's the professional illustrator. I'm new to this. I had no idea that I was not really wanted in that process early on. I had no idea I was, you know, badly overstepping bounds. But I cannot imagine anyone envisioning what I had in my head as perfectly on the canvas as Nancy did. It was a perfect match between what I was picturing and what you came up with.
Thank you.
That's incredible. And, you know, we have like 3 or 4 questions that are asking the same one for you, Nancy. And a good segue to this: how many hours did it take you to do this?
Oh boy, there's that question. Total hours was over 500. Yeah, I mean, I spent really the whole year working on this, not full time, but 540 to be exact. The average time per painting, now remember, this includes sketches and meetings and everything, was about 30 hours per painting.
She worked way harder on this book than I did. And she also worked harder on it because of me, because there were times when, like, she finished a painting of the bird flying over a tundra landscape with a moose in the spring, and I realized, like, belatedly in the process, wait a minute, moose have dropped their antlers by this point. Nancy, could you paint out the antlers on that moose? I mean, just dumb stuff like that. You realize things too late in the process. I'm sure she was cussing me under her breath, but she never did it to my face.
Just a tiny bit.
And we have, again, related to all this, Nancy, how did you decide to use oil rather than watercolor?
Yeah, well, I had been painting more and more in oil, and really my bigger fine art paintings were all in oil. And I also felt that for the seriousness of the subject, I really wanted to give it some depth and some gravitas. And I love watercolor. I've been painting in it my whole life, but I just felt the oil it just felt right to me. Yeah, that's the short answer.
Well, it certainly worked.
Thanks. Thanks.
So here's a question I love. And Scott, could you read a page or two from the book? And if it's not right in front of you, I'm happy to do it as well. So
give me 15 seconds to walk over and grab it. I didn't
Yep.
think to keep
We'd rather hear the words from you. So
okay, hang
please
on.
go ahead.
Hang on just a second.
I can answer the previous question about how I adjusted to the ages. Now, remember, I've been illustrating picture books for quite a while, so I was okay with the target age group, but I did want to appeal to younger kids. So that's why I put a little bird on every page. It might be big, but it might literally be the size of a pinhead, so that we can let our littlest ones practice their bird watching as they find the warbler on every page throughout the book. So that was fun.
And that absolutely happens, because that's exactly what my kids do. You turn the page and they point to the yellow warbler. They're finding it throughout the book.
Good.
Well, I've got the book here, and I'm going to read the 2 pages that, starting with the one that Nancy showed, the starry sky, and then the page after. So make sure you can see that. So that's, oh man. Okay, all right. She flew all night with brilliant stars to point her north. All around her, there you go, thank you. All around her, invisible in the dark, she heard the voices of thousands of others migrating north as well. She flew as the sun rose beyond her right wing and flew on as it sank, fiery and orange beyond her left wing. It was like a race with no finish line and no place to rest. But she was strong. This is what she was meant to do. The strength of her ancestors was in her wings. She flew as lightning streaked the darkness, as a cold wind blew hard in her face, and rain soaked her feathers. Lower and lower she flew as the dark, dangerous ocean grew closer. This is the lightning storm. She was tired, but she was strong. This is what she was meant to do. And that's actually a theme. There's 2 themes in this book that I really wanted to drive home through repetition. One is that these birds do these extraordinary things because that's what they're meant to do. And they do things that put human athletes completely to shame. And the other thing, whether we're talking about the nighttime in the jungles of Nicaragua, or deep in a swamp in the bayous of the south, or when the wolves are howling in the taiga forests of the north, I keep repeating, these are just the sounds of the forest. These are just the sounds of home. That at every point in this bird's migration, from the tropics of Central America to the subarctic in Canada, it's all home. These birds are not residents of any one place. They're residents of the whole. They encompass everything, and they're equally comfortable and equally at rest in all of those places. So
yeah, it feels like there's no greater indicator that the whole entire planet's connected when you really start to see and understand birds.
That's right.
Good question here. Were you both surprised by the acclaim the book has received?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was picked as an NPR favorite book of 2022. I'm delighted with that. Was a bit shocked, especially speaking as a longtime NPR geek. That meant a lot.
Yeah, me too.
Moving on to a couple other questions here. Nancy, what kind of surface did you paint on? And are all your final original paintings the same size and format?
The surface I painted on were actually panels. They're pre-made, basically masonite panels that are basically coated with a gesso. They're very flat, because I paint quite thin, because I'm started out as a watercolor painter. So very thin, a lot of thin layers of glaze, but they're hard. It's not a canvas. It's just a hard board. They're all the same size, 18 by 24, with the exception of the smaller spots of art that appear in the back of the book. Is there another
Thank you.
question? I can't remember.
I believe you covered it.
Okay.
Another one here, because the book has 3 key geographical areas, will there be translated books?
That's a good question. We talked about, because the Griffin Press has done Spanish language translations before. I don't know where that stands. We also talked, when I was up in the village of Letzel Cay on Great Slave Lake last summer, and took a great big box of the Warblers journeys up as a thank you to Irish Catholic and the other folks up there at Fedene Nene National Park Preserve. I talked with the folks at the Griffin Press about whether it might be possible to find a Canadian partner that would be willing to do a translation into Dene. And unfortunately, we haven't really made any progress with that. That's something I'd still very much like to do. But no, I should go back and see where they stand on doing a Spanish translation.
Scott, what's the average life expectancy of a yellow warbler? And how many times, so in that lifespan, how many times do they make that migration?
Yeah, so whenever you talk about lifespans in birds, you have to preface it by saying about 60 or 70% of all birds never make it to their first birthday. You know, whether you're talking about bald eagles or hummingbirds, most of them die as very young birds. They have a very high juvenile mortality rate. If they get past that first, 3 to 6 months or so, average lifespan's probably about 4 or 5 years for a small bird like that. And interestingly, there's with many small birds, there's a differential between males and females, that the males have a tendency to burn themselves out a little bit faster than the females. That's particularly true of hummingbirds, very, very stark in hummingbirds, but also somewhat true in so it's just like people, the guys tend to go a little bit earlier than the females do.
Scott, there's a couple, so I feel like there could be a whole lecture on this topic, but are there steps that landowners can take to help support warblers and other migrants? So, what are some of the, low-hanging fruits?
People can work with their local land trust, which would be an excellent source of information for all of these sorts of things. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot folks can do. God, where to even begin? You're right. We could spend hours talking about this. Actually, with yellow warblers in particular, yellow warblers are kind of an edge specialist. They're a bird that is often found around the edges of wetlands, in shrubby habitats, in thicket habitats, and thicket habitat, early successional habitat, shrubby habitat, is something that is of increasing importance and increasingly scarce in the Northeast, where we tend to have either mature middle-aged to mature forests, or we have cleared, open, developed areas, and not a lot in between. And 4 species like yellow warblers and common yellowthroats and brown thrashers and eastern towhees and so many other, and box turtles and New England cottontails, they need that brushy second growth, early successional habitat. Stream sides, if you're a landowner that has livestock, and this is less of an issue in the Adirondacks than it is in some areas, fencing your livestock out of the creek so you have healthy riparian zones along the edges of streams. That's really important habitat specifically for yellow warblers. But again, the experts at your local land trust can help you with those kind of management decisions.
Well said, Scott. Thank you. Okay, we have time for a couple more. There's a good one I'm going to close with, but I'm going to save that one because I think it's a great question. I think that'll be the last one. So there's some controversy about the negative impact of wind turbines on bird migration. What are your thoughts on this?
Wind turbines kill birds sometimes, depending on the place. So does climate change. So do windows. I mean, what frustrates me as a conservationist is that we as a society blew about 40 years that we had where the scientists were telling us this was going to happen, and we just ignored it. when we could have been doing slow incremental things to improve the situation, and we didn't. And now the house is on fire, and we got to throw everything we have at it. Look, there are places where wind turbines are probably not appropriate because of the large numbers of migratory birds that pass through there. I can think of some places, especially in the eastern Great Lakes, like Lake Erie, where Canada is planning on building large numbers of offshore wind turbines in Lake Erie, in places where we know large numbers of migratory songbirds are passing at relatively low altitudes. But climate change is affecting every single moment in a migratory bird's life cycle. It's changing food resources, it's changing weather system, it's changing wind direction and intensity, it's changing everything. It's making it harder for them to feed their babies. We're kind of at a point now where we don't have much of a choice but to throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at it. We are at a point now where we have to make some really hard decisions, and that means wind turbines, that means solar, that means it may mean an increase in nuclear. I mean, I'm speaking here as somebody who lived downwind of 3 Mile Island in 1978, and that's a hard thing for me to say, but we've squandered decades that we had to try to change things, and now it's pedal to the metal.
Well, hopefully all of the new technology and information we're learning about birds and bird migration, thanks to people like you, Scott, will be able to model for these things a little bit better than we
absolutely
were able to do in the past. So I guess there's a little bit of hope there.
Yep.
Okay, so before I pass it off to Kathy Woofter for some closing remarks and housekeeping items, I want to ask this one question here. What projects are you each working on now, and have you talked about collaborating again?
Nancy?
We have not talked about collaborating again yet. And I'm doing a lot of teaching this month. People like to get out and paint. So I love my teaching classes, and I'm also painting some animal portraits right now. That's what I'm doing.
Wonderful.
It would not take any arm twisting to get me to collaborate with Nancy again. I might have scared her off a little bit. I'm not sure.
Nah.
But,
We're good, Scott.
okay, that's good. That's good to know. That's good to know. I'm actually working on a new book about what's working for bird conservation around the world. The news can seem so grim so many times about the environment in general and birds in particular, and yet all around the world people are doing amazing things for birds and bird conservation. And in fact, this book touches on one of those examples. All around the world, indigenous communities are taking the lead in conservation and doing amazing things. I mean, the village of Letzel Cay on the east arm of Great Slave Lake, as Nancy said in her portion, took 6 million acres of their ancestral land and set it aside as Fidanenene National Park Preserve, which the community is managing in partnership with the Canadian government. And all across Canada, there are now dozens of what are known as Indigenous protected and conserved areas that total tens of millions of hectares. So, I mean, just gigantic chunks of intact boreal forest and subarctic land and temperate rainforest that indigenous communities have been managing for, since time immemorial, and are taking the lead on managing and protecting them today. And so, there's a lot of stories like that about bird conservation around the world that are going right. And I'm this year and next year, I'm going to be on the road looking into those things in Europe and Asia and Africa and South America and Australia and elsewhere. So going to be busy.
Well, thank you. We'll all be very excited for the next editions of your works to come out. And it was just such a pleasure to speak with you both tonight and to have you here. And with that, I will pass it over to Kathy. Thank you so much.